Welcome to those of you who are online. We're glad you can join us. What is your favorite holiday? Thanksgiving, Christmas, Halloween. Notice no one said Palm Sunday. We should have said Easter because it is the Super Bowl of Christianity and it's in 1 week. Yeah. How many of you guys like May 4th? May the 4th be with you. Star Wars Day, or more importantly, Tamra's birthday. She will accept cash. How many of you guys like August 24th? Some of you don't even know what that day is, but you will. That's when Starbucks brings back the pumpkin spice lattes. Yeah. I mean, that's a big deal. I mean, that's the reason why God invented pumpkins, is just so that we could have that holiday. According to the internet, which never lies, that was sarcasm. According to the internet, America's favorite holiday is not the 4th of July. It is not Christmas. It's Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is our favorite holiday, which shouldn't surprise us considering how much we love to eat. Some of you are already thinking about what you're going to have for lunch. You haven't heard a word I have said. Blah, 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 blah. Oh, Thanksgiving. Oh, yes. Let's talk about that, Pastor Dan. What do you think is America's least favorite holiday? Labor Day, Labor Day. It is Valentine's Day. Yeah, Cupid didn't get a vote on that one. My least favorite, though, is daylight savings. Yes, I think that one is by far the worst. There are 7 major Jewish holidays on the calendar. 5 of them come from Moses, 1 of them comes from Esther, and 1 of them comes after the Old Testament, which is Hanukkah. This morning, we're going to talk about Esther. We have been walking through the Bible. So every week, we've been talking about a different book of the Bible. And today, we are talking about Esther. So Esther before Easter sounds strategic. But I guarantee at some point, I'm going to try to say Easter and I'll say Esther. Or I'll try to say Esther and I'll say Easter. So you just know ahead of time. There are only 2 books of the Bible that are named after women. They are Ruth and Esther. We've already covered Ruth, and this morning we will cover Esther. So this is a big deal. We need to start near the end of Esther, though, to understand the purpose of this book. Why is it so significant? It is the last of the historical books in the Torah and in the Old Testament. It's the last. Esther chapter 9, verse 28b. These days of Purim, everyone say Purim, should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. The whole reason behind the book of Esther is explaining why we celebrate Purim every year. This is a major holiday amongst Judaism. Purim is like St. Patrick's Day or March Madness in that it's celebrated in March. So just last month. The book of Esther is read every day on the day of Purim. They go from chapter 1 to chapter 10 all in one sitting. They just sit down and they read through it, and it's a massive celebration. Purim is almost like Halloween in that everyone dresses up in costumes. It's very celebratory. People are eating triangle treats, which are very plain on the outside and sweet on the inside, and it's strategic. The reason why is that there are only 2 books in the Bible that do not mention God's name. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther at all. Esther does not talk about God, and the other book that God is not talked about is in what book? The Song of Solomon, the one you guys are waiting for. Everyone's like, Pastor Dan, when are we going to talk about the Song of Solomon? That one does not talk about God either. God is hidden. It talks about the hiddenness of God. God doesn't make an overt cameo like Stan Lee in the Marvel movies. And this is strategic. My youngest son, Colton, went to a field trip recently, and when he came back, I went to kiss the top of his head, and I could tell that he had been by a campfire. Now, he didn't have to say he had been by the campfire. I didn't have to see the campfire, but I could smell it on him. I could smell the campfire. God is seen throughout the book of Esther, but he's never acknowledged. He's hidden. kind of like our tech team. No one knows they're there until something goes wrong. It's like Grand Central Station. I see them every Sunday. It's quite entertaining, but you're not aware until something goes wrong. The book of Esther starts with a party. Everyone say party. Esther chapter 1, verse 4 through 5. For a full 180 days, he displayed, talking about the king, the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days. I've been to some pretty epic parties, but none of them that lasted 7 days. I was at a birthday party once, and the best part about it was the butter. You could eat it like a meal. I asked the chef, why is this butter so good? I mean, this wasn't like, I can't believe it's not butter spray. This was like real good butter. And he said it's because we ship it from Italy, it's slow churned, and it's 80% fat. Sometimes it's just better not to know what it is you're eating and just enjoy it. Don't ask questions, just put it in your mouth. Dinner parties show up a lot in this book. The word banquet is mentioned 20 times in the book of Esther. Only 24 more times in the rest of the Old Testament. Banquets are important to the book of Esther. It's during this first party that we meet King Xerxes and Queen Vashti. The name Xerxes literally means king headache. So he's different than most politicians. He acts like he's sponsored by Tylenol with all of the boneheaded decisions he makes throughout this book. He lives up to being king headache. Vashti means the beautiful one. Xerxes is throwing a 6-month-long party because he's preparing to go to war against the Greeks. We don't read this in the text, but we know historically he's about to go to war against the Greeks. And so he's trying to drum up support over this 6-month period to get sponsors to help him out with this war effort. Now, historically, he loses this battle, but that's not important to what we're talking about this morning. Esther chapter 1, verse 10 through 11. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, that's the Bible's way of saying he was wasted, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. He commands Vashti to come out like a living trophy, like eye candy, to show off in front of his investors. Jewish tradition suggested that she was supposed to come out with nothing but the crown on. The text doesn't say that, but we do know that she wasn't being brought out for her Bible trivia knowledge. They weren't going to ask her questions. The request is gross. She says no. Everyone say, yay, Vashti. Way to put your foot down. Jim Carrey once said, behind every successful man is a woman rolling her eyes. And Vashti was rolling her eyes real hard that day. There was like a wet spot on the ceiling. Now Xerxes is embarrassed. He's supposed to be king. His crown might as well come from Burger King because he seems to have no authority. How are all these people supposed to trust him to lead them in a war against the Greeks if he can't even lead his own wife? This is a huge political crisis. 10 verses are dedicated to him sitting down with his political buddies, talking about what do we do in this regard. It's a good thing politicians don't waste time on silly matters. So at the end of all of the talking, Queen Vashti is fired, never allowed to see her husband, the king, ever again. That's what we call a mantram, a tantrum for men. Esther 2, verse 2. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. There are 3 famous queens in the Bible: the Queen of Sheba, Queen Jezebel, and Queen Esther. We're about to see how Esther becomes the Bible's most famous queen, how a young Jewish orphan becomes the queen of Persia. Now, something that we don't always understand when we approach the book of Esther is that this is not like an episode of The Bachelor. Girls don't volunteer to go and see who the king's going to give a rose to. They are grabbed, taken. They don't choose or volunteer to be a part of this process. This is no fairy tale. There is no glass slippers, no Prince Charming, no whining and dining. This isn't Xerxes and Esther sitting in a tree, Kissing. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes a baby in a baby carriage. There is no love in this story. Xerxes is around the age of 40 when this takes place. Historically and culturally, we know that Esther would have been a teenager, around 14 to 15 years old. She is a child bride. Everyone say, ew. Now, we don't know if she wants to marry him or doesn't want to marry him. We're never told her thoughts on the situation. We're just told that out of all the young ladies, she was chosen to take Vashti's place as queen. That's all we know. Esther chapter 2, verse 17. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. According to Jewish legend, Esther was one of 4 of the most beautiful women in the world. It went Esther, Sarah, Rahab, and Suzanne Stanford. It actually says Abigail, but that'd make 5, so forget Abigail. Now, King Xerxes doesn't take much time to get to know his new wife. For example, he doesn't even know that she's Jewish. He doesn't know that her real name isn't even Esther, it's Hadassah. He knows less than a Tinder profile. All he knows is that she's a virgin and she's beautiful, so he wants to marry her. Esther chapter 2, verse 7 and 10. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother, so she's an orphan. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. Esther had not revealed her identity to the king. Mordecai told her not to because of the danger it would put her in. Now, this is going to play a big role in the story later on. Now, I'm going to show you guys a map. I'm going to show you an area, and I want you to tell me which football team that this area represents. Who do these people cheer for? So I'm going to show you a map first of Green Bay. Who do they cheer for in Green Bay? Winners or Packers? Okay, there you go. I heard someone say Bears, but that's definitely not true. Chicago, who do they cheer for? The Bears. All right, the next one. Detroit, who do they cheer for? Anyone but the Lions. That's who they cheer for because they're losers. All right. Just like football teams have territories, there's territories where they're known. So in the ancient world, territories had their gods, and gods were limited to territories. So if you were in Egypt, you typically worshipped Ra or Osiris or the Bengals. Walk like an Egyptian. If you were in Persia, you typically worshipped Ahura, Mithras, or Rashnu. This story takes place in Susa, the capital of Persia. This isn't in Israel. This is in Persia. And it's 100 years after the Jewish temple has been destroyed is when Esther takes place. So the Israelites are in captivity. Now, King Cyrus, not Billy Ray, gave the Israelites permission to go back to Jerusalem, to go back home. But for many, Persia was their home. It's where their friends and family and houses were at. So they had no desire to go back to Jerusalem. They didn't want to go back with Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. So the question becomes, is God the God of the Israelites in Persia just like he's the God of the Israelites in Jerusalem? Is God territorial? Is his power limited to Jerusalem, or is he still God in Persia? Don't spoil it. We won't find out till later. Esther chapter 2, verse 21 through 22. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bithna and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate the king Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. There are things in this world that we control, and there are things in this world that we don't control. In the book of Esther, we're going to see a lot of things that they don't control. They have no control over it. Mordecai had no control over hearing this plot, but he does have control over telling Esther about it. One person said, what happens if all of a sudden the grocery stores all close down and we have to start hunting for our food again? I don't even know where Little Debbie's lives. There are things that we control and there are things that we don't control, but here's the problem. We try to control the things that we can't control, and we don't control the things that we can. So Mordecai takes control and he shares with Esther what it is that he has overheard. God loves underdogs. The Bible is full of stories where slaves rise to positions of leadership. Joseph in Egypt, Daniel in Babylon, Mordecai in Persia. Don't let your position limit your mission. Don't let your position limit your mission. You can be used by Christ whether you are a CEO or an MOM. And sometimes the MOM has way more influence. Whether you got a PhD or a GED. Whether you're Generation Z or Generation ARP, there is no retirement in the Bible. But look at what happens after Mordecai saves the king. We read in Esther chapter 3, verse 1. So remember, he's just saved the king. The guy's name is Mordecai. Everyone say Mordecai. All right. After these events, King Xerxes honored. Who do you expect to have the name? You expect it to be what? Mordecai. But whose name do we see? Instead, we're introduced to the villain of the story, Haman. Everyone say Haman. Haman, son of a really long word, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. How do you think that made Mordecai feel? He just saves the king, but instead of being honored, someone else is honored instead. He sees this Haman being rewarded. This could be why Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman later in the story. Now, in a Jewish church service, whenever the name Haman is mentioned, they drown it out by yelling, stomping their feet, or using gregors, which I'm going to show you here. There you go. You twirl around, it makes a lot of noise. So they do a lot of booing like at a Nickelback concert. Just imagine that and you'll know what it was like. Now, Haman had 10 sons, which was highly respected in Persia. He was the man. But if you actually look at the book of Esther in Scripture when it was originally written, Haman and his sons' names were all written in the margin. And it was symbolic of them being set aside for destruction. So before you even get to the end of the story, you already know what's going to happen. There's some foreshadowing that they are going to be destroyed. Haman is referred to as an Agagite. Everyone say Agagite. Agag was the king of the Amalekites. They were the first people to attack Israel after they left Egypt. So they are the original enemies of Israel. This detail is important. Remember, we want to know, is God just the God of them in Jerusalem, or is he the God of them in Persia as well? Listen to this promise God made to Moses in Exodus chapter 17, verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Was this promise still true? Could God protect the Israelites from Haman, the descendant of the Amalekites, all the way in Persia? I watched a cartoon as a kid, and I can say 2 words, and some of you will know what this cartoon is instantly. Beep, beep. The Roadrunner. Yes. I was nervous maybe you wouldn't know. Yeah, work on my beep, beep. Wile E. Coyote set up elaborate traps to capture the Roadrunner, but what always happened to him? He always got caught in his own traps. The cartoonist Chuck Jones clearly didn't like coyotes. There are 260 different traps that he sets up throughout the cartoons. He almost dies 341 different times. from boulders, dynamite, rockets, pogo sticks, bear traps, and my favorite, painted tunnels. It was always my favorite. In the book of Psalms, we have the following passage. Let the wicked fall into their own nets. Clearly, Wile E. Coyote was a very wicked individual, always falling into his own net or his own trap. But we'll see the same thing happen to Haman. He might have felt like he was, hey man, the master of the universe. Thank you, Sean. But he was Haman going against the master of the universe. He will set up 2 traps, one for Mordecai and one for Israel, and both will backfire. Esther chapter 3, verse 6 through 7. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month, and the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Haman hates Mordecai more than Kanye West hates Pete Davidson, which is saying a lot. He hates him so much that he wants his entire family chopped down. And he casts lots or rolls clay dice to find out when the gods want him to execute this order. The holiday Purim comes from the word pur or lot, as in lottery. Haman casts a lot, and it falls on the same month as Passover at this time, which is strategic. Will God be able to deliver them from Haman as God delivered them from Pharaoh? He convinces Xerxes to allow the Pharisees to kill all the Israelites on the 13th of Adar, or the month of March. As for Haman, he builds a 75-foot tall pole to impale Mordecai on. That's 6 stories high. Talk about overkill. The Persians' favorite way of killing people was a human shish kebab, like a giant billboard, or like the snowman Olaf. Oh, it looks like I've impaled myself. But remember that moment when Mordecai saved the king's life, and the king rewarded Haman rather than Mordecai? Just because you're overlooked on earth does not mean you've been overlooked by God in heaven. God's delays are not God's denials. The night before Haman is supposed to be killed, Mordecai, let's look at what happens for Mordecai. The night before Haman is supposed to kill Mordecai, let's look at what happens. Esther chapter 6, verse 1. I know words. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. I think it's ironic that that's what he wants to fall asleep to. Is it like that boring? Like that's going to pass out reading about your reign? The king has insomnia. Sometimes that's a God thing. God needs to talk to you, and during the day, you're just not listening. But rather than play Plants vs. Zombies on his phone, he has someone read his diary to him. And he just happens to read about Mordecai saving his life. This is 5 years later. 5 years after he has saved his life. So what's the chances that that's the story he falls on? Out of all his diary, all of the various reports in there, he just happens to land on the story of Mordecai saving his life. Because of this, Mordecai's life is saved, and trap number 1 backfires. Well, what about number 2? What is the most powerful piece in the game of chess? The queen. If you think women are the weaker sex, try pulling the blankets back over to your side during the winter. My wife's got kung fu grip. I'm like, how come you can't open the ketchup bottle, but you can keep the blanket from me? God is going to use Esther to stop Haman's second trap. But she's hesitant. This was before the song, Who Runs the World, Girls, was invented. 2 relics have been discovered in Persia. Archaeologists found 2 relics. One of them is of a Persian king sitting on a throne, and he's holding a scepter, and behind him is an executioner holding an axe. Talk about a welcome mat. I've thought about putting this on my office door as the pastor. Enter if you dare. Only 7 people had direct access to the king, and the queen was not one of them. Only 7 people had the right to approach the king without his ordering them to come see him. If you approached the king without his invitation, you could be executed on the spot. Esther had not seen the king in months. She felt like she had fallen out of favor with him. She was no longer his favorite. Esther is the only person in the story with 2 names. Esther is Persian, and Hadassah is Hebrew. She's trying to live in 2 worlds, and these 2 worlds are about to collide. Mordecai nails it when he says the following: "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to the royal palace for such a time as this." So she bravely says some of my favorite words in the Bible: if I perish, I perish. I'm going to do it without the guarantee that God's going to protect me, that things are going to turn out the way I want it to, but I'm going to do it because I know it's right, not because I know the outcome. Esther will set up a banquet where just King Xerxes and Haman are invited. So all of Esther starts with a banquet, and Vashti loses her position. And now things are all going to turn around at another banquet where Esther is throwing a party. She will tell the king that someone is trying to kill her and her people. Remember, Xerxes and Haman don't know that she's Jewish. The king is flabbergasted. Who would possibly try to kill the queen? She points at Haman and says, "This vile man," we don't use the word vile enough in our culture, "this vile man didn't make my coffee right. This vile man is trying to kill me and my people." The king storms out. He's frustrated. He's flabbergasted because technically he signed off on this order. But he did not know, remember he's King Headache, what all that order entailed. Haman throws himself at the mercy of Esther. He falls onto the couch next to her. According to Persian law, you could not be within 7 feet of the queen if you were a man. You thought social distancing was a big deal. You could not be within 7 feet. Jewish tradition says that the angel Gabriel pushed Haman onto the couch just as the king was coming back in. This was a setup. Let's read what happens to Haman. Esther chapter 7, verse 10. "They impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai." Talk about happily ever after. Then the king's fury subsided. Haman is killed by the very weapon he was going to use to destroy Mordecai. Just like Satan is destroyed by the very weapon he tried to kill Jesus with. Now, a lot of people don't like the book of Esther. Esther is not a very popular book. A Hebrew scholar named S.R. Driver said that when you read the Old Testament, it's like you're in heaven, and as soon as you get to Esther, you fall to earth. John Calvin never preached from the book of Esther. I have now done something that John Calvin never did. Yay me. Martin Luther wished that Esther was not included in the Bible, but I think they're crazy. Esther is a very encouraging book if you read it through the right lens. Listen to Esther chapter 9, verse 1. "On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables were turned." Everyone say the tables were turned. The tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The key phrase of this whole book is the tables were turned. Are there some tables that God needs to turn in your life? Relationally, financially, emotionally, spiritually. While we do not see God overtly, He is working behind the scenes the whole time. There's things that we can control, there's things that we can't control, and the things we can't control is under God's control. What is over our head is still under His feet. Esther helps create a holiday that Jewish people celebrate to this day. Remember, the 5 main ones came from Moses, but Esther created one equally valuable because God turned the tables. They celebrate so hard that they jokingly say, Drink on Purim until you don't know the difference between blessed is Mordecai and cursed is Haman. A great salvation deserves a great celebration. This week, as we read through Esther, let's thank God that the tables have been turned through Jesus. Let's use Esther to prepare for Easter. So this week you're actually going to read through all 10 chapters of the book of Esther. We'll read it together. And as you do, reflect and pray, God, what are some things in my life that I have no control over, that I need to surrender to you and see you turn the tables in ways that I can't? There's a lot that Esther and Mordecai could not control, but they did control the two things that they could. Mordecai told Esther when he heard about the plot, and Esther bravely went before the king, even though she knew she might die because of it. But because they did that, you see all the other things that God did on their behalf that they had no control over.